get through this in minus 10 minutes. It's going to be a rush. I noticed people...
We're not on schedule.
No schedule.
There's no schedule.
I noticed people sort of introduce themselves with a tiny bit of history. I'll do the same. The main reason I'm in this hobby is because I want to learn stuff. I retired 12 years ago or something, and I didn't want my brain turning to mush. So that's why this hobby has been wonderful for me, being retired. One of the things was like 10, 12 years ago, I started making my own receivers, the Rabbit receivers, hip-hop system, frequency hopping, 8-channel radios, and I make those for myself. They're a 1/4 of an inch square and like 1/8 of an inch thick and weigh like a little over 100 milligrams. Nick makes them, if anybody ever wants to buy any. Nick makes them and sells them. So see Nick if you want any. I've used these in all of these planes in here, which I know a lot of you have seen, but some of you probably haven't. All of these planes here use the Rabbit receiver. They're all flying planes. They've all flown in the last week. I'll be flying some tonight. They range from 2 channels up to 8 channels. The most advanced one is this P51. It's 8 channels with elevator, rudder, ailerons, flaps, retracts, operable wing lights, and machine guns. That's the most advanced. So I got there about 3 years ago. I did that last time I was at NEAT 2013. I had that plane. Wasn't flying at all well, so I changed the receiver, and I've got a gyro controlled version of the Rabbit, and that's got gyros in it. So does the Spitfire, and that smoothed it out so I could fly the thing nicely. And there's a video on YouTube. I got a video here if anybody's interested later on. So I wanted a new challenge, and I saw this thing called the Expert. Is it E-Flight does it? And that fascinated me. I thought, the gyros in a regular fixed-wing plane are fairly straightforward. They're just rate devices. If the thing gets kicked, you counteract that. But to go to a thing like a quad where you want to hover, it's a lot more involved. It's a lot more difficult. So I wanted to find out that. And I saw this Expert, and this thing takes off and it flies like a plane, and then it goes back to hovering and lands. And I thought, I want to do that. So that's what sort of got me into this last November, and so I developed. Oh, where is it? I haven't even got it out. So here's an Expert. It's got 2 motors, 2 elevons, and that's about it. So,
Martin, can you hold that up so you can get that on the video? Oh, perfect.
And here's the prototype, which is basically the same plane. Where am I in my talk? Right, why am I talking about this? We covered that. There's a couple of pictures of those 2 planes to give an idea of scale, but you've got them here. So yeah, like I said, the flight envelope involves hovering like a quad or a helicopter and flying like a fixed-wing plane. And these involve 2 different regimes. I'll get into that. So these planes, they're flying wings, 2 motors, 2 elevons, like I said. And they're hybrids in 2 senses. They hover like a quad and they fly like a fixed wing. That's a hybrid. And they're hybrid in that they use the 2 motors for roll control, like a quad, but they use control surfaces for pitch and yaw like a plane. So they're kind of a crossover thing. One of these has actuators. The prototype has actuators on the elevons. The Bumblebee here uses servos, Nick's beautiful 0.4 gram servos on the elevons. They both use 8-channel radios. They've got 6-degree of freedom gyro accelerometer systems in them, and I use 4 channels for flight control, the regular controls for the 4 channels, and the other channels are used for adjusting the gains in flight and for triggering transitions and stuff like that, ancillary stuff. It's a single PIC microprocessor in these things, so there's only one. Usually with these things you have a flight controller and separate from the receiver system to drive. This is all done off one PIC, the same PIC that is in the receiver. And this PIC, it runs at about 8 MIPS. It's got no multiplier, it's got no floating point, it's an 8-bit processor, and that was part of the challenge. Can you do this, the whole thing, in one microprocessor? Turns out you can, just. So I wanted to learn about gyro stabilization, the flight transitions, and I did all the electronics. You can buy some of these things, but not this small, that I know of anyway. So all the code I wrote from scratch, built the electronics and everything all from scratch so I could learn about it. And the motivation for this talk is, well, hell, I spent all this time learning all this stuff. Why don't I come and share it as, a thing like this? Because I know there are people in this room who know a heck of a lot more about stabilization of these kind of planes. I'm looking at some people over here. So if I say anything wrong, be gentle, okay? Because I want to share some of what I've learned in this. One of the differences here, the way I chose to do it anyway, is these are, in some senses, harder than doing quads because you've got these 2 flight regimes. And the 2 flight regimes are quite different. So with a quad, when you're hovering, you're kind of in one mode, and then you tilt it forwards, and it starts going forwards. You tilt it a bit more, and you go forwards faster. But you're in one kind of flight mode. Up is always the same direction, and the controls are the same. Whereas with this, when you're flying, you're in a different regime altogether. And when you're on the ground, ready to take off, up is straight through the nose. When you're flying horizontally like a regular plane, up is out of the back. So the gyro orientation is different. The flight controls actually change. What you use for yaw when you're hovering is the other ones. For yaw, when you're flying, you use the motors. So that changes. The gains on all the gyros change. So there's a whole bunch of things. In fact, 30 parameters change when I switch from hovering to flying. So what I want to do is, it took me a while to figure out how to do this automatic transition from hovering to flying and back to hovering. And in order to understand, in order to describe what I did, which turned out to be quite simple in the end, it took me a while to get there, you need to know a bit about stabilization basics. Now, you all know what quads are. A lot of you have flown them. You could buy $30 planes at Target that have stabilization in it. What's the big deal? So what I'm doing here is technologically nothing new to me, except for perhaps for the scale at which I've done it. The expert that inspired me to do this is like this big. It's 22-inch wingspan. It's a big plane. So if there's anything new here, it's the size.
Did you buy one of those experts and kind of learn from it, or did you just say, they can do it, I'm going to see if I can independently pull this off?
No, I don't buy planes like that. I can't remember when I last bought a plane. No,
so you just did this independent?
I planes off friends of mine in the club, and a couple of people in the club who got experts, and I would watch them say, how did you do that? So anyway, yeah, so I just watched them.
Nice.
So stabilization benefits. So yeah, so I thought, a lot of you know what these things are. You've heard stabilization. You've heard about gyros and all that. Well, and in fact, 2 people here have come up to me and said, how do you do that? Can you explain to me how that works? And I thought it might be interesting to some of you who haven't dug into this stuff to know a little bit about what's going on under the hood. So that's part of the motivation here. Quick course in stabilization basics. So when you want to stabilize a thing like a quad or a regular plane, there are 2 main phases to doing this. You've got this loop going around in the software, repeatedly computing, and each time around it has to do 2 things. It has to keep updated an estimation of the orientation of the craft, of the plane. quad, how it's oriented in space. You need to know where you are at any time. So that's the first phase, figuring out where you are. And that's tricky. Second phase is basically, okay, I'm here, I want to be tipping forwards, because the guy's got the stick pushed forwards. How do I get the plane from where it is to where it's supposed to be, according to the controls, as quickly as possible, and without oscillating and all the rest of it. So that's the second part. How do you modify the signals that are going to the controls in order to make the plane go to where you want it to be? So, two phases. First phase is orientation estimation. Now, if we used old-fashioned spinning gyros, this would be pretty easy. In fact, people have made quads in the past, and with rockets and things, and with spinning gyros. There, the gyro stays where it is in an absolute position, and then the craft will move around the gyro. And all you do is find out where the gyro is relative to you, and you know your orientation. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but it's an absolute device, and you just measure where you are. With electronic devices, gyros, they're different. Electronic gyros measure the rate of rotation, how fast you're turning around the three axes. Not where are you, but how fast are you turning. And you can use that to estimate orientation. If you start off and I know I'm horizontal, and then you rotate the craft a bit, okay, you get told I'm turning at so many degrees a second. You can integrate that or add up those little increments each time around the loop and come up with where you are. There's a problem with this because you're doing this at hundreds of times a second and you got rounding errors. So after a very short amount of time, if you try to rely on this, you will lose orientation completely. But the good thing about the gyros is, if all you're trying to do is counteract the gust of wind, hey, it'll tell you that. Hey, you're rotating to the right at so many degrees. Okay, put the ailerons on. So gyros go so far, but they're hopeless in more than a few seconds. So we've got accelerometers. Accelerometers are there to tell you what your orientation is. An accelerometer tells you how fast you're accelerating in each of the three axes. And in this context, gravity looks like an acceleration upwards. Okay? So you might think accelerometers are the way to do this because at any one time you can read the three axes and tell which way is up or down. Trouble with accelerometers is a couple of problems. The main one is that they are very prone to vibration, to noise and vibration. And if you look at it, if your craft is vibrating because the motor's going at whatever, 12,000 RPM or something, 200 revs a second, if you've got a body vibrating at 200 hertz, at the extreme of the vibration, you're accelerating the other way, right? We've got a maximum acceleration and the other way. If you go at 200 hertz, if you've got a 1,000th of an inch amplitude vibration, you're pulling about a G, 1 or 2 Gs on that extremum. So if you happen to be reading the accelerometer just as your craft is vibrating that way, you will be told down is that way. Totally wrong. But over the long term, this all averages out. So over the long term, accelerometers get it right. If you filter the whole thing over the long term. It's just in the very short term, they're hopeless. So you've got these two devices. So you may have wondered, why do you have gyros and accelerometers? All you want to do is know which way is up, or what your orientation is in more general. And the reason is you need both of these to get the best of both worlds. So what you do is with the gyros, you make your estimates at each cycle of where the craft has moved to, and you do that with the gyros for incremental calculation. And from the accelerometers, you get a measurement of which way is up or down, and you combine these two. And there's a lot in how you combine them. But the basic idea, or the simplest thing, and what I do, is called a complementary filter, and you take a weighted average of these two readings. So, and it's weighted 20 to 1 in favor of the gyros. So in the short term, you get very good, accurate reading on how the thing is rotating. But over the long term, the average of the accelerometer dominates and you get the right orientation. And if you get those parameters right, you can come up with very fast reactions when you tweak the craft, and keep a very good fix on which way is down and for indefinitely long amount of time. So that's how those two are.
So, quick question. So, does that mean you're essentially zeroing out the error on the gyros? Like when you know you have a good level fix from the accelerometer, do you kind of reset
No.
the integration, or?
Well, when you take off, don't you? Or don't you? Not even then?
No,
Okay.
no, because the accelerometer is right away. I mean, I can turn this thing on, you know, lying on its side, put it on the table, and it knows which way is up. Because in the time, you know, it takes
But
me to do that.
he's asking, do you like one time zero it? It's a continual process of zeroing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So
It's
the
like
gyro drift is kind of being compensated for by
by
continuing
integrating the
filtering.
accelerometer over time. Yeah. I can't believe how well it works. Now, if you want to get more fancy, you use Kalman filtering to do the combination of the sensor input and all that. I don't do that. I complement you for it. I can't afford it in this little. This microprocessor is
No multiply.
4 millimeters square and less than a millimeter thick.
Could this
Get it?
be an inertial navigation system? Is it accurate enough, like, to figure out your 3D position within a space?
No.
You need absolute
Right.
heading.
Yeah, you need.
foundation.
You need some absolute reference. Like in my case, the absolute reference is gravity is staying in the same place, and over the long haul, it's staying in the same place, and that gives me this long-term absolute reference. But for navigation, where's your absolute reference?
Yeah, okay, so
don't go.
you know your orientation, but you don't necessarily know where you
Don't
are.
know where you are. No.
You could do it if you integrate your accelerometer and you start where you take off.
Yeah, but rounding errors will kill you.
Yeah,
Yeah, well,
Because
right.
there is so
You won't
many.
be good enough.
Yeah.
Because when these MEMS chips came out like 15 years ago, I thought about doing inertial, you know, like a data log. So if you're an aerobatic pilot, you can watch afterwards how perfect your lines are and your
Over a short term, I'm sure. it will
But if you had
work.
three-axis magnetometer,
Magnetometer gives you a reference.
It's a heading.
Yes.
You get absolute heading, but
Yeah.
you can't cancel.
You can't
out
tell where
with-
you are. Right, right.
So
right.
Martin, we know that you make the receivers, you know, the Rabbit. Can you just comment briefly? You've talked about these two components, the accelerometer and the gyro. Are those off the shelf that you've purchased? Are they tiny? Is that is that kind of part of this? I imagine.
Mind-blowing. I don't understand.
And are they something where they come in sizes and you've got the tiniest ones for these? I'm just.
Oh, I'm sure I haven't got the tiniest ones. The ones I've got are 3 millimeters square and 1 millimeter, a little less than a millimeter thick.
And are these something you can like buy on DigiKey?
You buy them and they
Okay.
cost $5.
It's because of smartphones.
Yeah.
Everything,
Okay.
everything
Yeah.
Well, that's my point. I wanted like so you're just grabbing those and you've written the software to integrate, but those are off the shelf.
Those are off the shelf. And
That's
there's a
what I thought.
microprocessor inside that chip, which is doing all kinds of digital filtering. It's magic what's going on inside that thing. And how the hell you get 3?
Yeah, just for those of us who don't like program these things, I wanted to clarify that
Thank you.
you're.
Yes.
the one chip has all the sensors in it.
They're all 6
All
sensors.
6.
Well, now, for some time now, they've got one with the 9 sensors,
Right.
the 3 magnetometers. I've got some. It turns out that inside the chip there's 2 dies,
Yeah.
and all I've done is taken these 2 products and put them on the same inside the same package. But no, it's incredible. So now you've got 9 sensors in this little chip. And
Why
I'm
don't
sure
you
there are
have
smaller
a
ones.
barometer, air pressure for altitude.
Don't know anything about that.
Next time.
Next challenge. Thank you. I was wondering what I was going to do next. Wonderful. It's amazing stuff. You know, it's not even clear to me what building from scratch means anymore. I mean, when you're tapping into these microprocessors, the radio chip, the gyro, sorry. I mean, that's not scratch.
Hey, they didn't
Huge
make,
amount of
they didn't make
technology.
vacuum tubes back in the 30s. They used off-the-shelf vacuum
They
tubes. So, come on.
So anyway, that's pretty much orientation estimation. So now phase 2. So from all that, you figure out this is where I am. Now I know where I want to get to. Quick word on that. Where do you want to get to? Maybe that's another phase. There are sort of, I don't know a lot about quads, but you know, there's 2 modes you can drive these things. One way is the stick is an absolute device. If it's pointing straight up, I want my craft to be there. If I lean it forwards 10 degrees, I want my craft to lean forward 10 degrees. Right? Go to the left hand, so on. And as long as you hold it there, you want your craft in that orientation. And then the other mode is a rate mode where you push the stick forward and you're saying, I want to rotate forwards by that rate. Oh, I should say, with the first mode, you can't do a loop. You can't take the lever on your transmitter and go all the way around.
You can flip your transmitter. So for those of you who don't buy regular models, but
No.
that's the difference between stabilized mode
Yes.
and acro mode.
Safe
on
mode
your
and acro
little
mode.
model drones and helicopters.
Although with this, I use priority, so in the spectrum sense. So you don't have, when you're flying normally, it's safe mode. If you apply large deflections, it's acro mode. And there's no switch over, it's a continuum. But anyway, that's another whole thing.
Do you
So-
fly it in here? Come on.
Depends on the wind. Yeah, we might. So the second thing is I want to get to where I want to be. So somehow you figured out I want to be here and I'm over here. How do I get there? This is a control system problem. Huge amount of technology being developed around this. You know, it's a whole science. You can take courses in it. But basically, how do I tweak the controls I've got to get where I want to be? You've got things like this in your thermostat in the house, your cruise control in your car. You want to be going a certain speed and you're going a different speed, and you don't want to accelerate too fast. You don't want to overshoot in speed. You know, get where I want to be safely, smoothly. That's the problem here. With us, it's current orientation to desired orientation. The difference between those is called the error in control systems. So I'm going to go into that a little bit because you need to know a little bit to know how to do a transition the way I do it. So I'll go as quick as I can, but bear with me. So what we do is we make several estimations. So how do we want to change the controls? So we do this in 3 ways and then combine them. The first, most obvious one, I should say, it's with a PID controller, PID. I think a lot of you have heard that phrase. I'm going to tell you what that means. The P stands for proportional. That is, you're going to apply a correction that is proportional to the error. You know, if you're flying your plane manually and it deviates a little bit, a little gust of wind, you apply a little correction, right? You see it's going off to the right. Oh, it's only a little bit to the right, a little correction. If it gets blown a lot and it goes a lot to the right, you apply a lot of correction. So it's very intuitive. The bigger the error, the bigger the correction.
Proportional.
Proportional, right. That's the P. You might think, well, more is better then. You know, I want to get it back quickly. So as soon as it deviates, get it back. So you crank up the gain on that. That'll kill you because now you're coming back so quickly, you overshoot. You've got momentum going with you, you overshoot. So, gone the wrong way. And you know, when we were all beginning to learn to fly planes, what did we do? We overcorrected, right? Standard problem. Well, same with this. So you can crank up P so far, but after a while you get oscillation. So that only takes you so far. So you want to speed things up and you want to damp out the correction. So that's where the D term comes in. I'll come back to I. The D stands for difference or differential. So what that looks at is how fast is my error growing? How fast am I deviating from where I want to be? And the thing about that is, I could be spot on where I want to be, but if I'm rotating, sometime in the near future, I'm going to be pointing in the wrong direction. So the D term can give you a predictor. Look into the future and say, okay, you're okay now, but you're going to be in trouble in, half a second because you're moving fast. So the D term says, okay, we will apply a correction that is proportional to the difference or the rate at which the error is growing. And this does at least 2 things. One is, as I said, it gives you a predictor so you can apply a correction earlier than the P term would, which has to build up. And the other thing is if you are tending to oscillate, you're coming back to center too fast, the D term will detect that and push you the other way. Okay? So this D term is a much faster reaction. And again, if you do it too much, it'll oscillate. So there's so much you can do with that. So, but with P and D, you can automatically guide a craft, a boat or a plane or whatever. There's still a problem with it though. Supposing you were flying, hovering a quad, and you get this problem with these things. The center of gravity center of mass on this is a long way from the center of pressure on the wing. So if you get a gust blowing, it will push this thing over. And P&D won't get you back, because when you are, in our case, vertical, go in the direction you want to go in, P&D is 0. P says there's no error. We're not turning. D says no error. But the wind is blowing, pushing you over. So what will happen with P&D is if you've got a constant bias on the direction you want to be going, it'll settle down to somewhere away from where you want to be. And it might be quite stable there, but it won't get you back to where you want to be. That's where I comes in. And, what would you do if you were flying a quad and you noticed it's blowing across? You apply a little bit of opposite stick, right? And you adjust that opposite stick until you've got it back where you want it to be. And you hold that opposite stick all the time. So there's a constant signal you're feeding in to hold that. Well, the way the I term works is it looks at the error, but it integrates the error. So over each cycle, you add up the errors. So the bigger the errors get, the bigger the correction this I term is going to apply. So it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger until it gets you back to where you want to be, and then it won't change anymore. It'll stay constant. If you go a little bit over, it'll subtract something from the integrated value. If you go a bit under, it'll add something. And so it'll hover around where it should be, this value, and the plane will be controlled, in that case, potentially purely by the I term. Because there's no error, so the P term is 0, there's no motion, the D term is 0. This thing has been held vertical purely by the I term. So you do need all three. So what you do is you've got these 3 potential corrections you're going to make to the controls on the craft, and you're going to add them up. And you take a weighted sum. So you multiply the P term by its gain. That's what the gain means. How much of the P term do we want? And same with the D, same with the I. You add them all up, and that's the control you apply, or the change to the controls that you apply to get the craft back straight.
That's your servo command, or your throttle.
Yeah, servo is a great example. PID control is a standard normally used in servos, and that's exactly what's going on. So we've covered all that. Okay. Yeah, there's an important thing. You've got to adjust these gains to match the plane that you're flying. So you can't take a gyro system out of one plane and stick it in another and expect it to work.
Even
right.
the same plane, if you change it from a coil actuator to a servo, you have to change the gains, right?
Yeah, yes.
It's all the way through the whole string.
Yeah. Oh, if you load up the plane with some extra payload, it will change.
Maybe if you change an elevation from sea level to up in the mountains, you might have
Yes.
changed.
This is one of the guys who knows more about this thing. So it turns out there's 18 gains that you've got to adjust for these things, because you've got P, I, and D gains for each of roll, pitch, and yaw, so that's 9. And I've got 2 flight modes, that's 18. So there's 18 gains. So this is why I've got this thing set up so that I can actually adjust the gains in the air. If I can keep it all straight in my head, that is. More to the point, usually fly it, land, and adjust the gain, and then fly again. It's very nice to be able to do it without downloading new software or something crazy.
Martin. One question about the difference between the servo and the actuator.
Yes.
The servo gives you a position control of the flat.
Yes.
The actuator gives you basically a force. And is that just a game changer or a game changer?
We have a comedian.
I'm gonna save that for last.
No, it's not a game changer. You can fly an actuator plane and fly the same plane with servos, and you think you're doing the same thing. Most of them, it's the same controls. It's the same for this. The automatic system it's very much the same. But
It flies at high speed completely different than at low speed.
Yes,
Then
yes, those are different.
Then you feel the difference.
Yes. In fact, to that point, I'll get ahead of myself a little. I have not yet succeeded in getting the Bumblebee to fly satisfactorily. This one, in spite of my pilot errors last night. This one was flown many, many times. It's the actuator one. It was flying well back in June. I've got videos of it, you know, doing the transitions repeatedly, sometimes even landing back straight too. Whereas the Bumblebee, I did that in the last 2 weeks, and I've not got it sorted out, and the problem is to do with the servos and the differences that you're talking about. Yeah. So, yeah. So transitions, how do you do that? That's the whole point of this talk, transitions, so let's get on with it. So you want to go from hovering to flight, to horizontal, and then back again afterwards. How do you do this? And my first thought on this was, well, that's easy. I've got this stabilization system. It'll just handle it, right? So all I got to do is I'm sitting there hovering. So now I'll download the 30 parameters. They're held in EEPROM in the receiver, so you just write them into the working registers. And so I'll just write those 30 parameters into the working registers in the receiver and say, let the stabilization system sort it out, because now I've got a fixed wing airplane pointing straight up, and surely the gyros will just take over and just smoothly take it into horizontal flight. It doesn't work. I don't fully understand why it doesn't, but some of it is
What did it do?
just every time. And I think there's a lot to do with, I'm making a bunch of approximations on the assumption that from frame to frame, from measurement to measurement, there's small changes. There's no big changes. I'm making small angle approximations, you know, not computing sines and cosines and any of that stuff. And what's happening here is this poor little plane, suddenly it wakes up as an airplane, got all these new parameters, and it finds itself pointing straight up. And it just overreacts. It's not designed to go from one cycle to the next with a change where, you know, it might have been doing, it thinks it's suddenly done that. And it doesn't like that. It's too sudden. And I'm sure some more sophisticated stabilization systems could handle this just perfectly. This is hopeless. So I came up with a different scheme, which now you've got the background to understand. What I do is, if you're hovering and you want to go to flight mode, I download all these parameters and set the P gain of the pitch to 0. Okay? Because it's the pitch control that's messing up. So, and it's primarily the P that kicks in first when this poor little plane finds itself pointing straight up. Okay? So I cripple it. I set the P gain to 0, and then what it should be for horizontal flight. Set it to 0, so nothing happens at the first instant. Then in the software, I ramp up the gain for P up to its proper value for flying over about a second and a half. So as I'm ramping up this value, it's getting more and more authority. So it controls, it damps that authority until it gets up to flying gain, and now I'm flying.
So you're changing your weighted average weights.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, the gain on the pitch, only the pitch.
Yeah.
And that completely smooths it out. So it gets it. And when you get to flying, you've got control on the stick. And in fact, while it's doing this transition, you can tweak it. You know, it's not like it's taken over completely. You can let it take over, just let go of the stick, click the switch to transition, let it happen. But with this, I can, over a second and a half, let the gyros settle down into horizontal flight. Then the second thing I found was just doing that wasn't enough. As you transition, you're getting lift. But remember, this thing is now, the thrust is equal to the weight by definition, because you're hovering. And for horizontal flight, thrust equals weight is overpowered. And so this thing would start just climb. And for indoors, that's no good. So I also, at the same time, ramp down the throttle over the same period. So the throttle drops to 75, and I keep it at 75 for the entire horizontal flight regime. Because I've got tons of power. I've got 2-to-1 power to weight, thrust to weight ratio. So with 75%, I've still got 1.5 to 1, which is way more than you need to fly. So I fly around with this 75% weight on the throttle, until you want to transition back. Now, transition back is very similar, but there's a catch to it. Transition back, do the same thing. Set the P gain of the pitch to 0, so nothing happens at first, and then ramp it up to whatever it should be for hovering over a 1.5 second period. So this thing, comes up vertical. The trick is, what should the throttle be? Because I'm flying around now with probably a lower throttle, and to get into a hover, you've got to have the throttle at the right place, and I don't know where that is. And the software, needs to set it. So what I do is, going back to the transition from hovering to horizontal, right before the transition, I record the current throttle. I remember what the throttle was for hovering. So when I come back from horizontal to vertical, I ramp the throttle, smoothly interpolated, from whatever its current value is, because of the stick, up to what it was before the first transition.
Do you have a time element that you've discharged your battery because you may not have as much thrust now?
Good question. Very good question. And no, I do not have time element. And let me explain the next step, and I'll come back to that. All right. So you come back to this throttle, which may be a bit low. He's right. You might. But now the system is controlling my throttle. It's holding it at that constant value. I want to get control. I want to land this thing, or I want to go up, or I want to get control back. How do I link my stick back to the throttle control? What I do is, if this is the throttle control here that the software is maintaining, and here's where my stick is saying I want the throttle to be, I'm having no effect until I bring the stick up to the level the software is dictating, and then I lock them together, and now I'm controlling the throttle. So when you come back to a vertical, you increase the throttle until it starts to climb, and then you're in control again.
So that's what it does. So if it takes more because the battery's low, it's measuring, and it says, I need a bit more.
No. It's come back and it's hovering, and let's say the battery is a bit low.
Yeah.
So it's sinking. So this level I'm using
Then
my
you
hand
apply
for
throttle.
it. This level here, I'm sorry, it's constant, but the plane is sinking.
And it knows that.
And
No,
the
it
stick,
doesn't.
no. And the stick is low.
No.
He does.
It doesn't.
Oh, you have to do it.
Yeah.
No, I'm controlling the stick. This is the
You need a
stick.
baro sensor.
This is
Okay.
the stick.
Baro
Yes.
sensor.
What a good idea, man. Yeah.
Well, can't you get the acceleration down and you're moving down?
It's probably slow.
But now I'm going, I thought you were having the system would detect it, but the
He's the
pilot's still
system.
there,
The pilot's
and you
the
say,
system.
I see it sinking, I gotta give it a little bit more. Okay.
Well, no, the stick
You
is
don't,
way
even,
low.
you don't even say that. I want to get control no matter what.
Yep.
Even if this thing is hanging in the air and the battery didn't fade at all. And so I push up the throttle stick until I see the thing starting to climb. And I'm locked
It's a
in. again.
natural thing.
Yeah, no, it's not, I like it.
Yeah. And if it happens that the battery has faded and it's sinking, well, okay, it'll meet me a little bit earlier. And now I've got control. Okay?
So it's good enough, yeah.
Yeah.
Now once you back up on the throttle, does it still maintain control, or once it matches up?
Once it matches up, you're now controlling the throttle.
Okay.
The only problem is if you recorded the wrong throttle setting before you went into horizontal.
That's
you
called-
actually
that's called-
climb as you
Yes.
transition back.
That's called a bug.
Yeah.
That's a very bad bug to have, because if you happen to reset the throttle too high and you're flying outside,
Well, you have to know about it and overdo it, and then you get
So why do you guide it through the transition by abruptly changing the desired orientation and then slowly ramping up the gain to that orientation instead of having a program either inside the transmitter or the receiver that will slowly change the desired orientation to your
that would
new system?
probably work better. Yes.
But you have gains.
It turns out
Yeah, do those gains linearly interpolate?
you got a lot of stuff to interpolate, but the main reason I didn't do that, and I think that's the way to do it. Yeah, it's probably the right way to do it. Again, I these two regimes and the way the software is written, it's not easy. It's probably possible, but it wasn't easy to. Let me say what you said in another way. You've got this set of gyros, and this way is up, right? And in the other regime, up is there. Now, why can't I just tell it, well, up is moving slowly from one to the other? And it turns out the way that I handle the gyros, to do that kind of interpolation, I can't do it. It's just not set up for it. But that would be good.
And did you say, is there a switch to tell it which mode it's in? It's not figuring it out from your commands. You have to say, I know.
No, it's channel 7. Right. Yeah. So, flight testing.
So Martin,
Yes.
when you go into horizontal flight, is it still attitude control or rate control?
It's attitude. It is. It's safe mode.
So that's why you have problems just
no.
switching over then.
No. Actually, so I say a word about priority. With priority, what you do is you figure out what the orientation you want is, like in safe mode, from the stick position, and then you also figure out where the controls would go, like with a regular plane. So if you push the stick, so far forward, you're directly affecting the servos. Then you take a weighted average between those two versions of what the control should be, where the plane should be, and they're weighted by the value of the control. Right, what does that do? What it does is when you're, let's say, hovering in the hover mode, you're in safe mode. The position of the stick is the orientation you want the thing to be at, okay? But if you give it a lot of stick, it will turn into a rate device, and it's a smooth interpolation between the two. So this thing hasn't done loops. You're flying along safe mode, you pull back on the stick way back, and it'll actually do a loop. I didn't change to acro mode.
But then
Let go of the stick, it comes back horizontal.
it's not a big mystery why it doesn't work to just flip over to the other mode, because
Oh, that's a good
at the
point.
same second you flip over, you should have the stick all the way back.
Yes.
And if it's not, you have a big error and it just bangs down.
Yeah.
Just the way you
That's
do
right,
it,
that's good.
yeah, that's why it doesn't work. But the way you do it, it's brilliant.
Okay.
It's so simple and it works.
It works. Yeah.
So why bother?
Just a word about flight testing. Flight testing these things is difficult, and I've seen videos of other people flight testing, including Matt and others. And unlike a regular plane where you can sort of get some idea it's going and it's stalling a little, or it's going off to the left, you can trim it back. With these things, you put on the ground, you hit the throttle, and they go. What do I change? What do I do? How do I get over this? It's awful. So what I did was a variation on what I've seen you guys talking about, but it worked extremely well. I've got these little eyelets at the top here and the bottom. Right now there's a carbon rod in there, but these two little tubes, one at the top and one at the bottom of the plane, okay? So I tied a piece of fishing monofilament line to the light fixture down.
Helps being a fly fishing man.
It does.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah. You go through these two eyelets in the plane, right, down to the toe of my shoe. Right? I got a piece of foam around on my shoe, right? So you're sitting in a chair, foot out like this. So you can pull this monofilament down nice and tight, or you can loosen it. So I put the plane on the ground and tighten the monofilament, and now it can only go up and down.
Plane's on your shoe, right?
Plane is on my shoe.
Yeah.
Right.
Make that
So you
clear.
take off, and this thing can only go up and down. Right? Can't go. So you take off, and you get an idea of what the throttle is like, and you
Wait a minute.
get the yaw. No, you keep it heel. You can
No,
see
but you
it.
want it to fly.
Foot doesn't go up.
Yeah, right.
So no, you're not going to make a fixture. You're just attaching it to your shoe.
Okay. Super glue it to the toe of my shoe. Right.
You put a long stick and then tip your shoe. And
Actually, I
then,
did that. So you start off, you get this thing going, and then you just tweak the toe up, so it just loosens. You don't have to tweak it very much. It loosens the monofilament, and this thing goes. And I went to the right, or gains are too high. Right? So now you can bring that back and loosen it a bit more, change the gains, trim a little bit, let it, but it's all under control. Perfectly under control. You're not smashing into any walls or anything. And so in the end, you can let it go loose, quite a lot loose, and control this thing. Now you take it off and fly it around. But even with that, this little guy is amazing. I don't understand why or how that has smashed into walls, ceilings, furniture, running machines, you know, dozens of times. I don't know why it hasn't broken yet. It's strange. Oh, the other thing is transitions. How do you test them? So for that, just a little practical thing, I hung up a painter's cloth, you know, those very lightweight, big, huge plastic cloth. Hung one of those up, offset a yard from a wall, a long wall in my house. And then you take off and do a transition, and you know, deliberately smash into it. But it's all soft, and the propellers cut holes, and it slides down. So you could do that and do that over and over and over again without hurting the plane. So little practical points. So I think I'm about done. Yeah. So
Fly it.
Fly it.
Hover. Just a simple 2-second hover. We don't believe you. Not everybody was at the indoor last night. Come on. Who wants to see him fly? Fly, 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 fly.
For all you said it was indestructible.
I'm going to pay for that.
We'll let you choose which one, Martin.
Right.
Because they both hover, right?
They do.
Well, no, you get 2 tries.
Yeah.
Nothing else to do. We're going to keep going with better, right? We're not stopping.
Yeah, I'm going to announce it. We're just going to keep the order, and it's going to be what it is.
I'm too enthralled by the plane.
Where's your checklist?
Too many switches. Okay. That's all. No pressure, right?
And you're not going to transition.
Yeah, no.
Although,
No.
You didn't bring your painter's turn?
Promise not to hurt it when you catch it. Yeah. That is great. So how fast can you fly it and hover? Just kind of, you know, so like 3 miles an hour, just.
yeah, you can do that. Yeah. I'm not going to push my luck.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
That was very slow.
What is the maximum altitude you can then reach? What is the maximum pitch level when you're in the hover mode?
I don't know.
Did you do that
About-
same transition
about
to agility?
that much.
Do birds go after it outdoors? Or have you flown outdoors?
No, but flies chase it.
Flies, yeah, it's a high pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Strange.
All right, so here's where we're going. We're not worrying about schedule.